from docking until the all-clear has been given on at least 20 passengers and crew, some of whom have flu-like symptoms. In all, more than 3,500 people are on board, including Kathleen Reed, who's from Texas.
I don't see anybody walking around that appears sick. There may be some. If they are, they must be in the medical area. You know, people are, I'm sure, a little anxious, but nobody has just gone screaming mad yet.
Princess Cruises is the same company that operated Diamond Princess. The ship held off Japan last month, from which more than 700 people tested positive for the virus and 6 died.
Stock markets in Asia have seen further sharp falls as fears grow that the coronavirus outbreak will push the global economy into recession. The Nikkei index in Japan closed down 2.7%. Last night, the Dow Jones on Wall Street ended the day down more than 3.5%. Monica Miller has been watching the markets from Singapore.
Investors aren't feeling confident that the coronavirus will end in the near future, which sent Asian markets off a cliff. The Nikkei ended the trading week by hitting a 6-month low. The Hang Seng and Kospi dropped more than 2% following Wall Street's latest tumble. The S&P Global Ratings has warned that the disease could wipe out more than $200 billion off Asia-Pacific economies this year. That's the lowest level in more than a decade. Governments and central banks have been rolling out stimulus measures to stabilize the markets. But the rapid spread of the disease and rising death toll are putting a greater strain on economies.
A ceasefire has come into effect between Turkish and Russian forces in the Syrian province of Idlib to stop them from being drawn into direct conflict. The deaths of 33 Turkish soldiers in airstrikes last week threaten to widen the fighting and pit Turkey, a member of NATO, against Russian troops backing President Assad. Paul Adams reports from the Turkish-Syrian border.
After years of war, displacement and diplomatic failure, last night's ceasefire was greeted with a degree of understandable skepticism in Idlib. The deal, brokered after 6 hours of talks in Moscow, cements President Assad's recent territorial gains, creating a new buffer zone along a strategic motorway that cuts Idlib in two. Turkey and Russia, which have almost come to blows in the past week, now say they'll work together to implement the ceasefire, end terrorism and help civilians return to their homes. It's a tall order. How the Syrian army and its militia allies, or the Turkish-backed rebels, including jihadi groups, will behave is anyone's guess. The latest reports suggest there was calm after midnight, but just before the ceasefire came into effect, Turkey said it killed 21 Syrian soldiers. 2 more Turkish troops also died.
Boris Johnson is facing a rebellion by senior Conservative backbenchers angered by the government's decision to allow the Chinese firm Huawei a limited role in building the UK's 5G networks. The MPs, who believe the company spies for the Chinese state, will try to amend a parliamentary bill next week to phase out Huawei's involvement within 2 years. The firm has denied that it's being controlled by Beijing. Our political correspondent Helen Catt reports.
Prominent Conservative backbenchers have repeatedly made it clear that they have serious concerns about the government's decision to allow the Chinese tech giant a role in building the UK's 5G networks. The amount of Huawei kit that can be used will already be limited to 35% of a network, and it won't be allowed at all in parts that are deemed sensitive. But the amendment seeks to completely end the involvement of high-risk vendors in telecoms infrastructure by December 2022. One rebel said that claims made to the Financial Times that as many as 40 Conservative MPs could back the amendment were credible. But another told the BBC the number was being significantly overstated and said the point was not to try to force a defeat, but to guide the government in a positive direction.
The leading American banker, Jamie Dimon, has undergone emergency heart surgery after complaining of chest pains. Mr. Dimon, who's 63, is said to be recovering well. He's overseen a major expansion of JP Morgan Chase over the past 15 years and is one of the few bankers to be a billionaire. More than 1 billion mobile phones and tablets around the world using the Android operating system are at risk from hacking attacks, according to Which. The consumer group says older devices are vulnerable because they no longer get security updates. Here's our technology correspondent, Rory Kethlen-Jones.
Google's Android is the dominant force in the mobile world, with the operating system running on 2.5 billion mobile phones and tablets worldwide. But after a few years, they stopped getting updates to the system from Google, which means they're unprepared for new security threats. Which says 2 in 5 devices, that's around 1 billion, are affected. Its researchers examined a number of phones from manufacturers including Samsung, Motorola and Sony, and found they were vulnerable to hacks which could see users having personal information stolen or running up bills for services they hadn't used. Many of these devices are still available to buy from online marketplaces. Google would not comment on the report.
Virgin Media has apologised after a data breach left the personal details of around 900,000 customers unsecured and accessible. The company said the marketing database was accessed on at least one occasion, but said it didn't include passwords or financial details. Government departments spent more than £4 billion on preparations for leaving the EU, according to a report. The National Audit Office says 22,000 civil servants were working on Brexit planning at its peak last October. More details from Leila Nathu.
The Treasury made an extra £6.3 billion available to government departments and devolved administrations to prepare for Brexit between June 2016 and the end of March this year. It covered plans for leaving with or without a deal. Now the National Audit Office has found that by the time Britain left the EU on January the 31st, at least £4.4 billion was actually spent. The Home Office, HM Revenue and Customs and the Environment Department accounted for more than half that amount. Almost £2 billion went on staffing and £1.5 billion on creating new systems and infrastructure, as well as communications. Departments have also reported £92 million in losses relating to Brexit. The NAO stresses in its report that it's not making a judgment on whether the spending represented value for money.
An NHS trust at the centre of an inquiry into preventable baby deaths is to repay almost £1 million that it received in 2018 for providing good maternity care. Shrewsbury and Telford NHS Trust was paid the money just weeks before inspectors rated its maternity services as inadequate. More than 900 families have contacted the inquiry to report concerns.
Thank you. The time is 8:10. People who have the COVID-19 virus are being given new advice that seems sensible to doctors, as we were hearing half an hour ago. That advice basically to stay at home. And a clear message as well that we are moving from the first phase of our response to the illness, trying to contain it, through to the next phase, which is delaying it and keeping as many people as possible from getting ill until the flu season is over and the weather is better. We'll talk in a few moments to Jeremy Hunt, the chair of the Select Committee, the Health Select Committee, former Health Secretary himself, of course. But first, let's talk to Sir Patrick Vallance, who is the government's chief scientific advisor. He was himself a clinical scientist, clinical pharmacologist, who's worked in academia and in industry, was president of R&D at GSK, the drugs company. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Perhaps we could start with the drugs side of this. People are obviously desperately keen that there is a working vaccine soon. What can you, from your knowledge of these things, what can we reasonably say about what we can expect and when?
So I don't think we will get a vaccine for this outbreak. I don't think we'll get something in time and at scale for this outbreak. That said, there have been remarkable changes in the ability to make vaccines and discover vaccines just in the last few years. And so things have progressed much more quickly than they would have done in the past. And it's not unreasonable to assume that we will end up with a vaccine. And we may do so in a year, 18 months, which is remarkable when you consider just a few years ago it would have taken 20 years to do that.
Yeah.
So not for this time, but I think good progress which could stand us in good stead for the future.
And antiviral drugs, which of course we already have.
Well, antiviral drugs we have, and that's a much quicker way to do things because they're already tried and tested in people. But of course they're not designed for this particular virus, and those are being tried, being screened in the laboratory, but also being tried in clinical trials. And I would imagine that as things develop in the UK, we would want to be part of trying out drugs in a clinical trial setting as part of that to find out what works and what doesn't, and we don't know at the moment.
Tell me this, a separate question, but a question that troubles people and concerns people. We know that the death rate for people who are older is greater. Do we yet know whether that is simply a function of being older, or whether it is a function of the other illnesses that one does sort of gather as one gets older? Do we know what it is that is causing that higher death rate?
Well, I think older people are vulnerable to all sorts of illnesses more than younger people, so there's a bit of just aging which makes you vulnerable, and there's definitely the situation that if you've got other coexisting diseases, you're more likely to suffer from this in terms of morbidity and mortality. So the death rate in this disease changes quite rapidly from essentially 0 in children up to 8 or so percent in the people over the age of 80. So there's quite a steep increase after the age of about 60, and much more steep increase in people with coexisting diseases.
And in that younger population, do we know who is particularly at risk and why? Because we're hearing that immunosuppressed people, so people perhaps taking some drugs for cancer, etc., and you can understand why that might be, because your immune system is damaged. But there is a wider group of people, isn't there, who have conditions like multiple sclerosis and Crohn's and other conditions that are the result of an autoimmune illness. In other words, the immune system has previously gone haywire and attacked the body. Do we know whether they're particularly at risk?
Well, we don't know at the moment, and of course some of those diseases are treated with immunosuppressing drugs, and so you might expect that some people might be at slightly more risk, but we're not seeing anything yet that suggests there's a significant mortality rate in the under 60s. So there will be people who are more vulnerable. There are people with diseases that make them immunosuppressed. There will be people on drugs that might make them immunosuppressed who will be particularly at risk. And that comes back to what we can all do. So we must protect ourselves, but we must also make sure that the actions we take actually are protecting other people. And that includes the basics, of course, like hand washing, but also the home isolation for people who get symptomatic.
Is it fair to say that we don't know what the death rate is?
It is fair to say. We think it's below 1%, and we're pretty sure it's 1%
right,
or lower.
Because Donald Trump said that on television in America, and a lot of people sort of said it's outrageous because it seemed to be rather reducing what other scientists were saying. But it is fair, is it, to say that actually, insofar as we can know, because of the undercounting in China, presumed undercounting in China, that actually the death rate is not what it appears to be in headline terms. Is that right?
Well, you can't just take the number of deaths and divide them by the number of cases to get it, because you don't know that you've caught all the cases, and there's a lag between cases and death. And we've been looking at this right from the outset with very sophisticated mathematical modelling, and we're confident of refining the death rate, the mortality rate down, and we really think 1% is probably the most accurate figure at the moment. It may be lower.
And we may never know, I suppose.
I think we probably will know once...
I suppose my point is that will we know everyone who's ever had it?
Well, at the moment, you can only test for virus, but many groups, including the world-class groups in the UK, are trying to get a test to measure whether you've got an antibody developed. Once you've got that, you can actually tell the proportion of the population that's been exposed to this virus, because there may be many who are asymptomatic, and at that point I think we'll get a much clearer idea of the number of people who've been exposed to the virus and therefore the overall death rate.
Just a final thought. I mentioned your academic and industry background. This really is a wake-up call, isn't it?
This is a wake-up call, and I think a lot of people have been working hard on this, and as a clinical doctor as well in the past, I mean, you know that these things can happen. I think what's really important is the advances that have taken place in vaccines, a particular type of vaccines, and that's what we need to be prepared for, because this won't be the last time we get a new virus.
Sir Patrick Vallance, thank you very much for talking to us. And let me turn to Jeremy Hunt, who's here in the studio. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Are we getting the information that we need?
Broadly, yes. And I think it was a very good thing that the government decided it would continue to give the geographic information as to where the outbreaks have happened. The danger in a situation like this is that if you restrict the information, you create a vacuum, and the rumour mill starts, the fake news starts. And actually the kind of very clear information that we heard from Sir Patrick Vallance just then is immensely reassuring to most people, that the realisation we don't know everything, but we are listening to the scientists to fill those gaps, and we're filling them as quickly as we can. I think that has to be the right approach.
On the other hand, if we hear and headline each death, we don't do that for flu. And it creates an atmosphere, doesn't it, that, again, listening to Sir Patrick, actually, given the potential possible death rate under 1%, we're perhaps possibly overreacting.
Well, you have to get that balance right, but I think on balance, the best thing is to give more information rather than less information, and that is because at the moment the government has got 3 very difficult judgments to make, and they need people to understand those are finely balanced judgments. One of them is when to actually declare that we've moved into the delay phase, because what that's basically saying is not that we've just moved into phase 2 of 4 phases. It's saying we will get to the final phase. We are no longer going to be able to contain this virus, and we have to get our heads around the possibility of, potentially similar proportions catching this virus to Hubei province in China, which we heard yesterday from Chris Whitty was around 20%. Then very difficult decisions about whether or not to close schools, because children can spread the virus, but also if you close the school, the mum and dad can't go to work, and we need those mums and dads, particularly in the NHS. And then the most difficult decision of all, which is when you have that peak period between 3 and 9 weeks, when to actually call that, when to say that peak period is starting, because that's when you're going to do the most socially disruptive measures, the cancelling of events, asking older people to stay on their own at home, and so on.
And that's the point. Are you going to do those socially disruptive things? And I think in particular sporting events. We had the boss of the Cheltenham Festival, the racing event, on earlier in the programme, and they're going ahead next week. Football, there's a friendly, an Italy-England friendly planned at Wembley at the end of the month, which, would you advise that goes ahead?
Well, I think you have to listen to what people like Sir Patrick Vallance and Professor Whitty are saying when you make that decision. But there's no doubt that when we get to that final phase, mass public gatherings will stop for that short period of time.
But I think actually in the football match is a mass public gathering in which a lot of people will come from Italy.
Yes, indeed, and that may well be a reason why it ends up being cancelled. But I think the priority, you were talking about the mortality rates for older people, the priority in that period of 9 weeks is going to be to stop older people, the people most at risk, being exposed to the virus. So that's the period of peak measures, and I think people are rightly saying you don't want to do that too soon, because it's going to be a very, very intense period.
But on the other hand, you think of sporting events that are optional and voluntary. They obviously do great things for people's morale and all the rest of it, but you think of Premier League football. You think of the very early decision the Irish took to stop their match that would have brought a lot of Italian fans to Dublin to watch. Do you think we are approaching the moment where the government might, never mind what happens with schools and other things, which have a big impact on the economy, the government might intervene and say, no, we don't want these large groups of people gathering at sporting events?
I think we are approaching that moment. The exact time that you make that call is, of course, very difficult, but I think that what we have in this country is a very high degree of public understanding of health and health risks. This is the country that basically invented the concept of public health when we realised the impact of dirty water in London. And so there's a very high degree of understanding, and people are getting the message about washing their hands and those kinds of things. I suspect we will want to err on the side of caution on these things, but they are fine judgments. There is a huge amount of potential economic disruption, as we saw from Flybe yesterday. So that's why you want to be careful not to jump the gun.
Jeremy Hunt, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The time is 22 minutes past 8. He is the close ally of the United Kingdom, a ruler of one of the Emirates that make up the UAE, frequently in the royal box at Ascot. And Sheikh Mohammed of Dubai has hit back at a ruling in London that has held him responsible for abduction and intimidation. He says the High Court's finding of facts over his treatment of his wife and 2 of his daughters told only one side of the story. Well, one of those daughters is Princess Latifa, who briefly managed to escape Dubai in 2018 with the help of her friend Tina Yaoyainen, who's on the line now, as is David Hay, co-founder of the Free Latifa campaign. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Tina Yoyainen, what was your reaction to seeing this ruling from the High Court?
I was very, very pleased that the reporting restrictions were finally lifted, and obviously I was very pleased with the ruling, and now finally the whole world knows that Sheikh Mohammed did indeed kidnap 2 of his daughters, Latifa and Shamsa. and he can no longer cover up the abuses.
David Hay, he said, and this was in relation to the whole raft of issues and questions that the court considered, including relating to his now former wife, Princess Haya. Sheikh Mohammed said, as a head of government, I wasn't able to participate in the court's fact-finding process, and this resulted in the release of a fact-finding, in inverted commas, judgment, which inevitably tells only one side of the story. I mean, he tried very hard to prevent this ever becoming public.
Yeah, I mean, simply put, that's a lie. I mean, it was his application to the English courts in the first place. And when it was obvious that when the evidence against him, when Tina put in her very detailed witness statement about everything that happened 2 years ago, when that went in, all of a sudden he withdraws from the process. His own court application, he withdraws, and he didn't want to take part. If you read the judgment, it's very clear that he, at one point, suddenly didn't want to take part in the process. So it's not a case of him not being able to take part. He didn't want to.
So are there questions for the British government, then? This is someone who's a close ally of the United Kingdom, someone who comes back and forth to this country a lot, who has significant assets here, indeed who has children here.
I think there are. I think it's a landmark judgment. What this judgment found is that, certainly in relation to Shamsa, Sheikha Shamsa, which was Latifa's elder sister, back in 2000, that she was kidnapped on his instructions from the streets of the UK with assistance of his men. That's a serious criminal offence that took place, and the judgment infers that there was a cover-up of it from the Foreign Office. Now, we've already seen that the Shadow Attorney General say that investigations now need to be made. Dominic Raab needs to respond to this. But that's a very, very serious finding for a very senior UK judge to find against the leader of an ally.
And Tina, as far as the other sister is concerned, Princess Latifa, who you helped escape Dubai in 2018, do you have any news of her? She ended up being forcibly returned there. Was that the last you heard of her?
Yes, unfortunately, I don't have any news of Latifa. The last time I saw her was on the boat exactly 2 years ago. We just passed the 2-year anniversary of the day of kidnapping. So I have no news of her. I'm obviously extremely worried. I wish she hasn't given up hope, no matter in what situation she's in at the moment.
There were some images that were subsequently seen of her when the former Irish President Mary Robinson, it appears that the invitation of Princess Haya went to visit, and Princess Latifa was seen in those pictures.
Yes, those are actually the only pictures that have been released since the kidnapping. And in those pictures, it's very obvious that Latifa looks uncomfortable. She's avoiding looking at the camera, possibly even medicated.
And how did she speak of her father to you?
She spoke about her father, often referring to him as a public figure, not a father figure at all, and obviously, yes, quite a cruel person, really.
Was she frightened of him?
I believe she was.
Well, the documentary Escape from Dubai, The Mystery of the Missing Princess, is being screened again on BBC Two tonight at 11:05. Tina Yoyainen and David Hay, co-founder of the Free Latifa campaign. Thank you both.
26 minutes past 8. Time for the sport, and here's Gary.
Morning. The draw for the quarter-finals of the FA Cup is now complete. Manchester United will be away to Norwich after United's comfortable 3-0 win at Derby. The match will be played later this month, and here's United manager Ole Gunnar Solskjaer on the trip to Carrow Road.
Tricky. Carrow Road is a difficult place to be. We've been there before this season. We played well and scored 3 goals, missed 2 penalties. So we know we're up against a team that plays some fantastic football at their best. So we've got to be on our toes. But we're looking forward to it. At least we're with the route now.
In the early hours of this morning in Florida, England's women were beaten 2-0 by the United States in the 14 tournament. Former England player Claire Rafferty joins us. Claire, good morning.
Good morning.
What did you think of the game? America scored twice in 2 minutes. They also had one disallowed. What did you think?
Yeah, well, England was the second best last night, / early hours this morning. 2 fantastic goals and a bit of a lack of concentration from England was the difference.
6 defeats in 9, as you say, second best, poor form. What's your assessment generally of the team?
I think they just lacked a little bit of tempo and intensity and a little bit of self-belief. USA obviously has a bit of mental block to them after losing out in the World Cup to them in the manner in Lyon. And I just think I'm just not sure that we actually have enough to be better than USA, and I think that's just a fact we might have to take on board.
Yes, a couple of the pundits on the television, you possibly saw them, former England internationals, they were talking about England going backwards. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think that's a little bit harsh. I think USA, obviously, they're actually out of season as well, so they've done really well to perform the way they did. I think there's been a lot of tinkering with the team. Phil Neville's yet to find who his best 11 are, and obviously the Olympics are coming up, so I think in my eyes that looked like a team that was probably for 2021 rather than the Olympic Games coming up.
And mentioning Phil Neville, the manager, how much pressure do you think he's under? Remembering, of course, he got England to the World Cup semi-finals.
Yeah, you know what, I think we're all a little bit harsh on him. The World Cup he did very well. But I think the issue is that he talks a big game and obviously has a lot of belief in his team. So in doing so, he sometimes creates a little bit more pressure for the team. But I think if he doesn't win his next 2 games, he's got Japan and Spain coming up, then questions are going to be asked.
Claire Rafferty, thank you very much. And that match with Japan is on Sunday. There are 3 matches in Super League this evening with commentary on Warrington against Castleford. Leeds return to the top of the table after hammering Toronto 66-12. In a few hours' time in Orlando, Rory McIlroy will start the second round of the International Golf Tournament, 1 stroke behind first-round leader Matt Every. How about the tips? How about them? They run at Chelmsford. At 3:40, number 6, Baltic Prince, and then Foss-Lass. 5 minutes to 4, number 5, Prez. What are you laughing?
5 minutes to 5 is when it gets in.
Gary, thank you very much.
5 minutes to sometime.
Now let's find out who Lauren Laverne is dispatching this morning.
You could probably say I'm difficult.
My castaway this week is Dorothy Byrne, Channel 4's head of news and current affairs. She began her career as a newspaper journalist.
I wrote to 50 newspaper editors saying, "Dear lucky editor, you have won, you have won, you have won. You have won the trainee journalist of a lifetime." And 49 editors ignored that, but Rex Pardo of the Waltham Forest Guardian contacted me and said, "That was really funny," and he gave me a job.
Dorothy Byrne, My Castaway on Desert Island Discs, this morning at 9.